You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Okay, welcome to today's Hayek Program podcast. I am here with Tomasz Agencki, who directed a film about Menger. Tomasz, very much welcome.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
My name is Erwin Dekker, and in this episode, we're going to talk about this wonderful movie documentary about Carl Menger, considered the founder of the Austrian school. The title is Notes on the Margin. Carl Menger is considered the founder of the Austrian school, and the film is as much about his tumultuous life as well as his groundbreaking ideas. We are talking with the director of this film. Tomasz, let me first congratulate you on the amazing film. I've written quite a bit about Menger, and I know some scholars who have tried to work on his biography, worked closely with Tomasz Christofori, who appears in your movie as one of the experts. And I must say, I still learned a lot just about his life, about what he went through, especially about his early life. I think the movie contains a lot of new things, new images. More than that, I think relevant to you as a director, I very much like the visuals in the movie.
Oh, thank you very much.
From a painting that featured Menger and his student Bern Bawerk during some parliamentary discussions, I believe, about the gold standard, and to all the homes where he lived, some great historical documents, and an actor dressed up as the great economist. There's plenty to see besides the maybe inevitable talking heads that make up any sort of documentary film, but it really looks great.
That was a challenge because, and thanks for noting that and pointing on it, because it was a challenge. There's not much of materials about Carl Menger, so you have to forget about any vlogs, recordings, pictures. We had like 5 or 6 pictures available. There's not much on it, so yeah, we had to, I don't know, use anything that would help us tell the story.
Yeah, well. Let me first ask you what you hope to achieve with the film and what your vision was for how it should look or what it should tell or which audience it should reach.
So the first idea was that, I read a lot about Austrian School of Economics. I even read the audiobook of Human Action in Polish. So it's available for Polish listeners. So I know at least the basics of it. And we often talk about Carl Menger as the founder, the godfather of the Austrian School of Economics. But we don't really, until at least, we're talking about the pre-movie era, there was nothing about Carl Menger. Of course, there were chapters or short, like summaries of his work. You can buy his books, but, it was like decentralized knowledge. So everyone knew something about Carl Menger, but there's not a single book. There's no biography of Carl Menger. And we can learn a lot about, Ludwig von Mises, for example, from Guido Hülsmann, right? Great work about him. But you cannot really find a point where you can learn about Carl Menger. Who was he? And if we are all inside this Austrian School of Economics, I think we should have something to relate to have this one piece of work that tells you the whole story, when and where it all began. The origin movie of the Austrian School of Economics, because who was he? Was he a libertarian or a socialist? Nobody knows it. And as I said, it was all decentralized. And I thought that this is the first, that was the first idea, to put it all together in a way that you can consume it. You can sit down for 1 hour and a half and you basically know everything, and it's distilled because there is a number of speculations circulating around Carl Menger. And as I said before, there's no single book that would deal with it. Yeah, that was the first stop, the first station of that work.
Yeah, no, great, and I fully agree. Right, it's striking that there is not such a thing. Obviously, he contributed a little bit to this as the film shows, because his papers were burned. The film is not exactly conclusive on whether he burned them himself or whether it was some wartime measure. But it seems that in some sense, right, he wanted his work to speak rather than it be about him as a person or something of the sort. Or at least I got that impression.
Yes, and he was burning his notes, his correspondence. So there's not much of like archive material about him. On one hand, I wanted to speculate about as many things as possible, just to I don't know, go back and like rewrite the story of Karl Menger from the cradle to the grave, where it all began. His progression, because he was not always this classical liberal, how it started and how it finished, and the aftermath and the afterwork we have left, all the heritage.
So let us start at the cradle. The beginning of the film starts in Novi Sad, which probably you pronounce a lot better than I would. So please correct me in a moment. But it's a small town, 7,000 people. This is where Menger was born. Where is this town, and why do we keep seeing a lake when the town is mentioned in the movie?
Okay, so your pronunciation is correct. It's Nowy Sącz in Polish, and 7,000 inhabitants. It's that was back in like 1840. Right now, it's much bigger than 7,000. I would say, for sure. Why we keep seeing this lake near the Nowy Sącz? Because this lake is like 50 kilometers from Nowy Sącz. It's actually Maniowy, a small village. And and somebody will ask me like, what the lake is the village? In 1997, there is a lake where there used to be a village. Now this village is relocated. It's called Maniowy, and this village, in my opinion, is crucial to understanding of Karl Menger, and it's very symbolical, at least for me. Because when you read the Principles of Economics, the Grundsätze, his greatest book, the very beginning of the Austrian School of Economics, right? He uses a lot of examples, the real life example. And actually, when he was a small kid, when he was 10, when he was 15, he was living there. And these are his observations from this little village of Maniowy. And right now, this village is underwater. So for me, that was quite symbolical. We have to dive to find as much as we can.
Yeah, I like that metaphor. Where is this place for people not so familiar with the local geography?
Okay, it's southern Poland. It's close to our southern border.
So Karl Menger was born into a family with a lot of children, 10 children, 6 of which survived beyond a couple of years old. As we know, child mortality was quite high. He was survived with 2 brothers and 3 sisters. Can you tell us a little bit about the family and their place in the community? Because they seem to occupy quite a special place. They seem to have been quite wealthy from some entrepreneurial ventures earlier in the century.
Oh, yes, of course. The place where Karl Menger was born was actually stricken with poverty, but his parents were quite, well off. His mother came from Czech Republic. She was a daughter of an entrepreneur and also of a landlord. Actually, Karl Menger's grandfather was the owner of this Maniowy estate. So that was quite something, you could say. And so they came from what we now call Czech Republic. And his father, Anton, was born in Lviv, which since like 14th century was a Polish city. Back then, it was under the Austrian rule. And he was an entrepreneur, but only in his like later years, several years before he died. Actually, he was a statesman. He was working for a government. He was a lawyer. Back then, being a lawyer meant that you're one of not many people who know how to learn, read and write, for example, something like that. So yeah, they were doing quite good, but still living quite modest life, I would say, very humble.
Yeah, and they seem to be, in some sense, at least that's what the impression gave me, was that they were somewhat progressive because the local populace seemed to like them, even though they were the landlords. And I imagine in some sense they were the local nobility that, of course, often exploited the peasants, but that didn't seem to be the case here, right?
Yes, because Karl Menger's grandfather was entrepreneur first and then a landlord. So he was not really in that tradition of exploiting peasants. He treated them as partners.
So he grows up there, loses his father early, as you say. I think around the age of 8, so young in his life. Lives in many different places. I think the film does a wonderful job of showing all these places. But as an outsider, I was just curious how close all these places were to each other, or whether Menger, to some extent, was already a great traveler. I'm taking a couple of steps now, but he spent some of his time in Krakow, in Prague, Vienna, Chichen, some other local places. Are these places far from each other? Would they have been very different at the time, or were they, because they were all in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, fairly similar? How should we think about this?
No, the distances between Nowy Sącz, Maniowy, Kraków, and Cieszyn, where he went to his high school, are not great. But to go from Nowy Sącz to Prague, that was, back then, it was a huge trip. Enormous, hundreds of kilometers. And I don't know how they did that. I don't know how many days it took to travel from one place to another. It must have been an enterprise on its own to go there. Yes, but it was much. Everything was there. Everything was inside this empire. So there was no passports.
And regarding languages, would he have spoken, because the film makes clear that he has some sympathy for Germanic culture, and obviously he wrote his major works in German. Would he have grown up speaking Polish?
I'm sure he spoke very well Polish, and there are proofs. It's impossible to live there and not speak Polish. It's impossible there. But his father was more in the sense of Germanic culture in a way. So his father was this, the statesman, the lawyer, and he always found that the German language is the language of civilization. But actually, back then in Nowy Sącz, back then in these areas, to survive, you had to speak Jewish, Polish, German, all the languages. So it was a huge mixture, very diverse place. Of course, he spoke German, as we know it. But there are, of course, his, at least what I know of, he was a friend of Julian Dunajewski, who was his teacher in Krakow. And Julian Dunajewski also lived in Vienna later on. And they met on many occasions because Julian Dunajewski also worked for the government in Vienna. So, and also, when you go to a gymnasium, which is the high school, you had to know Latin and Greek. So he was 15 years old, and he probably spoke Czech as well, because his mother was from Czech Republic. So this is like 8-9 languages by the time you're 16.
Yeah. No, I mean it's amazing, and I know it's partly speculative in the historical work on Menger, but during the 1860s, right? And this is now the decade that he is 20 years old. He's studying everything. One of the things he certainly studies is the evolution of languages, which is connected to studying the evolution of law. And right, he becomes famous for talking and writing greatly about the evolution of money. But yeah, I think in that setting of the Habsburg Empire, and in that multicultural setting, right, this interest for languages seems to have been there for him too.
So and everything starts there. This is why that's why there's such a huge, this formative years of Menger, they are so heavily, I would say, underlined in that movie, because this his ideas about the evolution of money, everything starts there. Evolution of institutions, everything starts in this multi-diverse, almost chaotic environment.
Yeah. So I wanted to move on a little bit in his life. One of the things that seems to be a recurring feature is that Menger gets in trouble with authority, or in some sense doesn't like authority much. Early on, as the movie shows, he gets rid of the nobility title that isn't quite clear maybe where its origins are precisely. Then at the gymnasium, his high school, which you just mentioned, he gets in trouble, or his brother seems to get in trouble for having unorthodox religious views. Then again, during his student years, he gets into conflict with university authorities over various issues. Then, of course, we might say that intellectually he gets into trouble with the German historical school, which is the dominating intellectual tradition. Maybe not so much in the empire, but certainly in Germany, where, as you say, a lot of people even in the Habsburg Empire, are looking toward Germany for sort of as the leading cultural authority. And of course, they're not the only ones. The Americans during that time also go to Germany to study economics. And then even very late in his life, he marries Hermine Andermann, a fairly young woman, which again puts him at odds with some of the norms of his time. What do you make of his personality, having made a movie about it? And since you lay out this pattern in the movie, is this the defining character trait of Menger?
I think it is, and I find this really interesting about him, and I really respect him for it, because it's not stubbornness, it's like standing your ground. He had this strength to fight for his own ideas. That was great. He was a nonconformist, but he was not an outsider. So he was not antisocial nonconformist. He believed in what he said, and what he fought, and it was great. He had this power, this courage to fight for it, even if when it meant dire consequences.
Yeah, because they often are, right. It obviously impacts his career. It impacts even where his students can and cannot obtain positions and go. But it impacts his personal life toward the end. But it also, in some, I think, striking sense, upsets his early scholarly life, because he gets into university and gets into conflict with the authorities. Doesn't really finish his studies until he's in his late 20s, because he gets kicked out of university, if I understand it correctly.
Yeah, because he wrote an article condemning the new policies of the university. And if you think about his family life, about his tutoring of Crown Prince Rudolf much later on, or even this event with Anton Menger, his younger brother, who denied the dogma of the original sin, it was not Karl Menger who was in trouble in high school, but he was supporting his brother. And if we look at it from this perspective, we can see that Karl Menger was always on the brink of losing his position, no matter what position that was. He was always fighting for it, and everything was at stake. And on the other hand, he had a huge position because his achievements in life were enormous. And he wouldn't be where we would never hear about Karl Menger if he was, a little bit more conformist, a little more practical. So this is why he was losing a lot, but he was also winning in those situations long term with this attitude.
Yeah, so we get an image of a man of principles. In the beginning, you brought up this elusive question about what his politics actually were. But in his 20s and maybe in his 30s, do you now have a better sense of where he stands? He's very clearly progressive, right? He rejects the nobility title. He works for commercial presses. He's attracted to Vienna very clearly, or at least attracted to emerging cities and urban life, which at the time would have been the progressive thing to do, right? In some sense, the conservative might have stayed in the countryside and tried to continue some of the lifestyle there, as well as the estate there.
I think he was very socially aware from the very beginnings of his life, and this is also something that comes from his background in Nowy Sącz, in Maniowy, in those little Polish cities back then. So he was much closer to the, let's call it, like bleeding heart libertarians than to the Rothbardian crowd, anarcho-capitalists, which is also quite interesting, because I've heard a lot about Karl Menger, that he was like the first libertarian or something like this, which is absolutely nonsense. And yeah, he was socially aware and he cared for the poor people, but he knew that, you will not help them by printing money, for example, that there are other ideas that had to be implemented to elevate them, like education, for example, and access to education, access to books, that was his idea.
Yeah, the other point about that, which I think here the Menger scholarship, I think, has improved from either being silent on that issue or indeed trying to impute to him some 20th century position. But he was very clearly a reformer within the empire, right? And some of his students were too. So he wasn't thinking outside of that structure, but he was thinking of how that structure could modernize itself and keep up with the times.
And this is why he went pretty well with Crown Prince Rudolf, who was very open to new ideas, because, Crown Prince Rudolf was flirting with socialist ideas of the day at his point. So, and actually it was Crown Prince Rudolf that was like a hope for this empire to be more open, progressive in a way, not in this modern sense of being a progressive, but to, the empire had to change a lot to not disappear. And it didn't, so it disappeared. And that was pretty bad news for Menger later on.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit, because we're calling him Crown Prince now, but people familiar maybe with that culture or who have seen any sort of a historical series or movie about that time will know Queen Sissi, the first royal celebrity. They might have heard of Emperor Franz Joseph, who almost like Queen Elizabeth reigned forever. Who is Crown Prince Rudolf? When does he live? What's his relation to Menger?
So Crown Prince Rudolf is an heir to the throne. He is the son of Sissi and Franz Joseph, of course. And, and I'm only stressing this connection because I don't think there was any connection between Sissi and Karl Menger or Franz Joseph, except for like short letters or something like that. And this is also something extraordinary because, Karl Menger came from this really poverty-stricken land, and 3 decades later, he's not only doing well in Vienna, he's not only teaching, working on university and publishing articles and writing books, he's also the tutor to the, the next Caesar, right? So I thought, isn't that like the best job that you can land as a teacher in an empire? Is it anything better than this? And he's not teaching him about biology or something like that, which is also very important. He's teaching him the political economy. So for the future king of the empire, for the future Kaiser, this is the most important thing. So this is a huge job for him. And I really think that, I think that Sissi is quite overrated. I don't know if you agree with me, but wherever you go to Vienna, you can find her anywhere, right? She's everywhere. You can buy a coffee mug with Sissi and a pencil with her and a T-shirt. I don't know if there's any paper about how much GDP of Austria depends on Sissi right now, but she's selling a lot of merch.
Yeah,
right
she's
now.
Still you guys as Taylor Swift. I fully agree. I mean, I must say that I was in Vienna a couple of months ago, and at least the museum now is very, very much aware of the fact that around 1910, right, there's just and of course it starts earlier with Menger, but that in the years leading up to World War I, Vienna is just the most amazing intellectual place to be in the world, and I think that awareness is growing, but I don't know whether they'll ever beat the celebrity of Queen Sissi, and I don't know whether all the tourists go there. But yeah, I agree with you. Absolutely.
We all have this kind of Romy Schneider vision, right? Like a happy princess imprisoned by this old grumpy king in a castle. And it sells.
This is true. Yeah, and it in some sense, right, this was, I mean, obviously that's also a modern phenomenon, royal celebrity, but Karl Menger writes a kind of pamphlet or publishes for the Crown Prince a pamphlet, which is in many ways quite critical of this old-fashioned structure of the nobility just, being unreachable and being, there either to put on display or to naturally govern. Can you tell us a bit more about that pamphlet?
It must have been a great time where you could write a pamphlet that would be a scandal. I could not imagine something like this happening today. I think they were trying to shake the ground a little bit because this pamphlet was published anonymously. And so we don't know who wrote this pamphlet. And they were criticizing this very old structural conservative powers. They tried to put some fresh air into it. But I read it some time ago and I didn't find it, shocking. So this is why I'm quite flabbergasted that a piece of paper could be such a scandal back then.
Well, you're a movie maker. Movies have managed to do this in the 20th century. But I agree. I remember reading the pamphlet and thinking, well, people must have almost known who wrote this or that it came from high up in the nobility, because otherwise the pamphlet seems fairly innocuous, right? But of course, who says something matters a great deal. So maybe the word was out at the time. So we're talking a lot about Karl Menger, and we know him as a great economic author. We now know the pamphlet. I just want to take us a little bit back to this period of the 1860s, in which he is sort of finding his footing in Vienna and some other cities in the empire. And he works for a long time as a journalist. And the movie spends quite a bit of time talking about this period. I think the period is also very important because later, at least I know that some of his students look back upon this period in the 1860s as a period of great reform, maybe the most liberal decade of the empire. Can you tell us a little bit about this period and Menger's work as a journalist? What do you come away with? Because the movie has experts both saying, well, the journalism was really formative, as well as, well, the journalism was a way to find his footing and to earn some money, but we're not so sure whether it was so important in shaping his economics.
I'm not a historian of Austro-Hungarian Empire, so we call this era liberal, but it was only liberal when compared to Austria's neighbors. It was not a libertarian paradise back then. Of course, you have abolition of serfdom. Of course, you have growing parliamentarism. You have new constitution, more civil liberties, expanding voting rights. This is this liberal flow that we are talking about. But there was this idea that liberalism will help, to coexist inside this very diverse ethnic empire. It turned out to be impossible with this growing popularity of nationalisms and socialism. So, the more the voting rights were extended, the less the liberals played any role in it. And I would agree with what you said about Menger's formative years when it comes to journalism. I think Menger was quite lost in those days, in my opinion, because he got kicked out of the university in Prague. He had to do something for a living, so he was writing. He loved that, by the way, and he was an entrepreneur, and his first newspaper failed miserably. And then he was writing for other titles, making good money, and he was working for the government at the same time. And still he was thinking about his ideas. He was still trying to go back to this academia. And I think those were the days where he was trying to find himself. So he was doing quite well. He was earning good money. He had a position. It was already a success for somebody coming from Nowy Sącz back then. It was already a huge success. But I don't think he was satisfied with it. And then again, we see Menger in action, where he decides to cut it out and to go back to academia and focus on what was the most important thing for him.
Yeah, I've already bothered you with loads of historical questions, and I think they're amazing. But we also have you here as a director, so I want to turn to a couple of questions about filmmaking. Was this your first project in which you tried to do a historical documentary film, or how would you even categorize it? And maybe what did you learn during the making of this process?
Okay, so first question. No, that was the first historical biopic in my career, and it's the longest movie I've ever directed and edited. And I tried as much as I could to not to make it a historical biopic of an old time, long dead economists from Austro-Hungarian Empire. I tried to make this movie as if it were, I don't know, a movie about somebody I know, about my friend, about somebody I respect. But of course, it's full of historical data it's full of, there's a lot of, economy, at least the theory in that movie. But whenever I could, I tried to steer away from it, to concentrate on Karl Menger as a person not as a tutor, not as a godfather of the Austrian School of Economics or author of a pamphlet or any book. But of course, it's impossible to do it when you talk about Karl Menger. So there was a lot of traveling. There was this idea to follow his life. And when I started, as I mentioned before, I tried to read anything I could about Karl Menger, and it took a really long time to see the shape of the movie, to see Karl Menger how he was. So the beginning was I had like a number of ideas, thousands of ideas how this movie could look like, but there was no available data, no photos. Everything was, as I said, decentralized. And so I had to, everything was dictated by what was available back then. So we had an access to several Menger events. There were several Menger historians, economists who could tell me something about it. And just like 1 year or 2 years before we even started thinking about this documentary, a historian from Poland, Dr. Łukasz Połomski, he found the birth certificate of Karl Menger. And using this birth certificate, you can spot and you can find the birthplace, the house where Karl Menger was born. And then I met with Łukasz Połomski several months before we started shooting, and we talked about it. And then I had this idea that since we have no data, almost no data, no visual data on Karl Menger, maybe it's a nice idea to follow from the cradle to the grave, to do it the classical way, and see this whole progression. But let's try to connect this old times, old days of the 19th century with today's streets of Vienna, of Krakow, of Prague, of Nowy Sącz, so that we could maybe imagine how it could look like almost 150 years ago, 170 years ago, because there is a connection and you can feel that, and you don't need those old photos of those streets. So those streets were like every building is like a witness to something that happened 100 years ago. So I also had enormous help from Reinhard Schumacher, who gave me a list of possible, it was also a speculation, houses where Menger lived in Czech Republic, in Vienna, in Poland. So we started with the first house, the house where Karl Menger was born, and we found the place where he died, the last house where he lived during the First World War and a little bit after that. So I tried to follow Karl Menger. I was constantly searching for him.
Yeah, no, I think you succeeded wonderfully. Like I said, I mean, it really gives character to the movie. And yeah, the historian you mentioned, I think he's also in the movie, right? Łukasz Połomski. He's really a distinct voice. The YouTube version that will certainly put a link up in the show notes, right? Comes with great subtitles. He's one of the very few people you have in there who speaks Polish rather than English.
He's the only one. That's the only non-English interview we have.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, what he adds to the movie, to me was absolutely amazing, right? He does a kind of local history that in my neck of the woods, the historians of economic thought, we typically don't do. But he does such an amazing job of giving us a picture of what life was like back then, and down to the conventions on the birth certificate, as you mentioned. It's wonderful.
And it's also typically when you produce a documentary, you start with a research. With this project, the research was done on the editing table, which is upside down totally, and that was one of the problems I wanted to fix from the very beginning. I knew that I would have, let's say, a number of interviews, 10, maybe 15 interviews. And I already spotted that people are not, on the same side when it comes to details about Karl Menger. So there was also a diversity of opinions about where he was born, how many siblings, places, street, everything was like, it was impossible to edit the documentary because there was like 17 different stories in one. So we had to do an enormous amount of work simply to spot, who is correct, who tells the truth. So the final version whenever there is any speculation that we are not sure about something, I give that to the narrator. And in Polish version, it's my voice. In the English version, this is Tom Woods. So whenever there's a speculation, I leave it for the narrator, which is me. That's my voice, because we may not be sure, like you mentioned, about those letters and notes that were burned during the First World War. So this is a speculation. We will never know it. We only know that it's lost. But whenever there is a fact, something that really, we know that it happened, then I leave it to my guests to say that. So I think and this is only the beginning, because this is really humble documentary. This is not a huge, Netflix, HBO production with like $10 million on a budget, right? That's a very humble production. But at least I think we have this base, maybe to continue other studies about Karl Menger. I hope someone else in 5-10 years will produce a different documentary with new available data, maybe even contradicting some points from my documentary. I'm hoping for it.
No, I think that's exactly the right spirit, right? There's never anything definitive when we do something like biographies, and it would really be wonderful if we get, well, both a book version of a biography as well as indeed further visual materials. I would very much welcome that. You told me when we were getting ready for this interview that you had done nearly all of it by yourself. Was there something that motivated you to do it? I know that the opening credits speak of the Mises Institute in Poland. What was the infrastructure like, or was it very much a self-made project?
Well, Polish Mises Institute, they came with the idea of a movie. So they came with an idea of a movie. We spent a number of hours talking about it. But then when it started, I was absolutely 100% on my own. I was simply responsible for delivering the product. That was my role. And I'm used to work as a camera operator and director, as a one-man team, actually. And you mentioned about this Karl Menger, that there is an actor playing Karl Menger in our movie. Actually, we were not able to finance any actors in that movie. That is just a backstage material of an event that was produced by Hayek Institute in Vienna. And they produced like a short video with an actor playing Menger. And I went there. I talked to Barbara Kolm, who orchestrated that online event. It had to be an online event because that was the COVID era. So everything was online back then. And I went there with my camera to take some shots of like a backstage shots of this production, because I knew that I from the very beginning, I knew there will be problems with illustrations. We will have a number of talking heads, which is fine, which is great, but there are no illustrations for it. So any kind of event, there is one event in France that we filmed, one in Nowy Sącz and also in Vienna, 2 events in Vienna, because there's the huge Austrian conference as well. So anything related to Austrian School of Economics that happens right now is my goal. I need to go there. I need to find anyone talking about Karl Menger. I need to find any picture of Karl Menger hanging on a wall. Everything can be used as an illustration, because it's a desert. There's no visual materials for it. And I really like to travel alone. Of course, I would love to do it with a huge, at least, 5 members crew, to have everything, professionally done with sound, with lighting, with everything. But this time, we had a very limited budget. So I was there on my own with my tiny set of lighting, my audio equipment, 2 cameras, tripods, and everything. And I had to take care of all of that. And during the interviews. But it was also I really like it, because I'm really, when I'm doing this interview, I'm really talking to somebody and I'm learning. And each interview I had was longer than the previous one, because, I learned and I had motivation to ask more questions, another person. And then, what happened was that then I discovered that not everyone is sharing the same facts. And I already noticed with at least 2 of my interviewees that they were incorrect with some details about Karl Menger. But after watching the movie, they started, they fixed those little mistakes. So I think this movie is already doing its job.
Excellent. So to close this off, I wanted to ask whether there's any projects like this for you in the future, or are you back to making some other kind of movies? What's next?
Well, since we have finished this production of Carl Menger, and this production of Carl Menger documentary took more than 3 years, I already had, I don't know, 2 or 3 premieres of new documentaries that I've directed, and I wasn't really thinking about producing another biopic of a historian. But if anybody has any idea, I'm open for suggestions. But this time I would like to produce a documentary about a historian where there is even less data available about that person, because it really opens your imagination when you have to use anything for an illustration. I don't know, maybe I was thinking about Frederick Bastiat, for example, because we have nothing about him. No, but actually, even right now, I'm working on several other projects, but we have just premiered a short documentary, and by short I mean 40 minutes. Compared to Menger, this is a TikTok short. 40 minutes about it. The title says it all: How Sweden Quit Smoking. So it may not sound like a libertarian documentary or something like this, but my idea is to promote classical liberal ideas, without this recommended reading list, without mentioning even the names of the great minds and the books. My idea is to show real life experience examples of like liberty in action, to build this kind of intuition. And we just produced and premiered a documentary about, the nicotine market in Sweden, which nobody talks about ideas in that documentary, but it promotes the ideology, these ideas of classical liberalism and limited government. And it hit 1.5 million views. So I think it's doing well.
That's amazing. Absolutely. My mind is just still on how I'm going to visualize Bastiat's petition to the candle makers, and whether you're going to have boarded up houses and to symbolize the sun that's being kept out to protect the candle maker industry. Tomasz, it's been wonderful talking. I really, really enjoyed it. It was great to hear from the director's side. And of course, also thanks so much for sharing everything about Menger's life. And all I have left now to do is to recommend everybody to make sure you get to 1.5 million views on the Menger movie as well. It's on YouTube. It's free to watch for anybody. I don't know whether there's other methods to get it, but please let me know.
Thanks for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. I'm always happy to talk about Carl Menger.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.